618. The Trump tour of the Middle East is really quite something. Big business deals, boosterism, a shiny new superjet for him as a gift, the Saudis, the Qataris, marble palaces, even the new president of Syria, President Sharar, once an al-Qaeda leader regarded as a dangerous terrorist by the Americans, but now, in Donald Trump's words, good, young guy, attractive guy, very strong. He's lifted sanctions on Syria and is even talking about wanting to do a deal with Iran. This is geopolitics as entertainment, diplomacy as a circus. But it's all quite real and consequential. Next stop, quite possibly Turkey, for direct talks on Ukraine, although that depends on whether President Putin decides to turn up to meet Ukraine, Zelensky and Trump face to face. The world is truly changing in front of our eyes. What is a business deal and what is politics? Under Trump, it's really hard to know. Let's talk first to Jeffrey Feltman, the former US Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. I wanted to know just how important this visit was.
I think it's extremely important. It's an unusual visit, but then we have a most unusual presidency, as I'm sure you're already quite aware. But it was quite dramatic, the announcement yesterday that he was going to be lifting all sanctions. President Trump would be lifting all sanctions on Syria, since the U.S. sanctions are the ones that are most important in terms of trying to rebuild the Syrian economy. And then the meeting today with the Syrian president and the fact that he's not stopping in Israel on the way home. You may remember that in 2017, President Trump also went to Riyadh, also had sort of gala receptionists as he's had on his first stop on this trip, but then he went to Israel. This time he of course now is in Qatar, his second stop of the trip, and then he'll be moving on to the United Arab Emirates. There's not been a sitting president of the United States that's been to Doha since 2003, George W. Bush. There's not been a sitting president that's been to the UAE since 2008, also George W. Bush.
So if you're sitting in Israel and watching this and you see the president going to the Gulf states and to Saudi Arabia and talking in such a friendly way to the new leader of Syria, you're thinking these are the countries which in the past have been very much on the Palestinian side trying to negotiate a future for Gaza. Will you be worried about that? Do you think there's an element of unease in Israel? And if so, is it justified?
Well, I don't think any of us should underestimate Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel's ability to spin things to make it look good for him. So who knows how he will spin this trip. But I would imagine that there's deep unease in the Israeli Prime Minister's mind, as well as in his circle, for a number of reasons. First, the outreach to Iran, the direct talks to Iran, where Netanyahu is basically faced in public with that announcement when he made his last visit to the White House. Then there's the outreach, of course, to Syria, and where Israel has been quite clear that they're unhappy with having what they see with having a former jihadi, Ahmed Ashara, now president of Syria. There's also a very deep distrust between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Turkish President Erdogan. Trump has reached out to Erdogan. Erdogan joined the meeting by telephone today with Shara, and then Trump authorized direct talks with Hamas in order to get the last living U.S.-Israeli hostage released from Gaza, which happened on Monday, also without Israel's sort of knowledge in advance. So I think that there's a lot that would make the Israeli leaders uneasy right now. But again, my guess is Benjamin Netanyahu will try to find a way to say, hey, this is great. I mean, you've seen President Trump already said, what do you mean this is bad for Israel? President Trump having all these great relations in the Gulf, that's good for Israel. So I think you'll see a spin despite what must be unease in Jerusalem.
I strongly suspect you're right about that. Can I ask you about the potentially most momentous aspect of all of this, which is the holding out of a hand towards Iran? Because Iran has been the really big, momentous player and the most dangerous one from Israel's point of view. And it does appear that President Trump thinks that there is some kind of deal to be done with Tehran.
Yes. I mean, he's given very mixed signals because on the one hand, he's had quite belligerent language about Iran, including earlier today. On the other hand, he's made it clear that he wants a deal. And the question is, what would that deal look like? And there's been mixed signals on that from Washington, where can Iran maintain a civilian enrichment program under tight regulation, tight controls? Or is the United States insisting on having it dismantled entirely? Right now, the rhetoric seems to be leaning toward the latter, an entire dismantlement of the program, which would make it very, very hard for Iran to come to an agreement on that. But I don't think we've seen the end of the story yet. There have been 4 rounds of negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, brokered by the Sultanate of Oman. There's been cautious optimism that comes out of those talks. The foreign minister of Iran is in the UAE today, so he's talking to the Emirates just before President Trump gets to the Emirates. And there's a difference between these talks and the ones that President Obama conducted before the last Iran nuclear agreement, which is that the region's behind it. Now, Israel, no. But before the Gulf states, the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular, were very much opposed to what President Obama was trying to do with Iran. Now, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are very much in favor of some kind of U.S.-Iranian deal to protect themselves, because they see potential military action against Iran as having negative repercussions on them, that they would be targets.
And perhaps this is the real business being discussed sort of behind the scenes and away from the hoopla of that we've seen in public.
Yes, I think I'm sure that's right. I think that the hoopla is part of the importance of this trip for President Trump. He likes the hoopla. When he was asked about the decision to lift sanctions on Syria, which I think was unexpected by those of us that have been following this file for some time. It was a surprise. He said it got the biggest applause in that room. So clearly the hoopla, the public adulation that he's receiving in the Gulf is an important part of the trip for him. But behind the scenes, undoubtedly, there are policy issues being discussed, such as the Iran talks, such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Mr. Feltman, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC.